world, it's time once again for the Cameron Files, and it's held exclusively right here every Tuesday night on KGRAradio.com. Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you all here in America had a wonderful Labor Day holiday, and it was uneventful for you. You had a good time, didn't spend or lose too much money, and now we get to look forward to fall. Football season is on us, and hockey season starts right around the corner, and before you know it, we'll be looking around the ground at all of the beautiful white stuff. And that's one of the great conversations I always have with Grant every year. I always call him my brother from the Great White North. He's got a wonderful guest on deck for us tonight, Dr. Joseph Burkes, and I don't want to banter too long here. I want to go ahead and get Grant on here, and we'll get the show going. So, Grant, welcome back to your show, The Cameron Files, and did you have a good weekend?
Yeah, well, I'm retired, so it's all weekend to me.
Is it now?
There you go. We were kind of watching, we had a holiday up here too, but the only thing that really changed is everything was closed yesterday. Otherwise, it was the same old, same old.
Right. Yeah, the package store was closed here. We were going to try to make a last-minute run to get some drinks, and the damn place was closed.
Yeah, that's weird.
That's kind of the way it goes in some of these states down here in good old America.
Yeah.
Well, Grant, listen, you've got a great guest on deck, and as we usually try to catch up and what's trending and what's going on, let's just wave that and get the show going. Sure. We're going to run uninterrupted for the entire hour. It's brought to everybody by presidentialufo.com. Go check it out. Everything UFOs and presidents, you're going to find it right there. Grant, take it away, brother. I can't wait to hear what you've got in store for us all.
Okay, thanks, Race. Good evening. It's October the 4th, 2018. This is Grant Cameron, and you're listening to the Cameron Files. Thank you, as always, for taking some of your valuable time to listen. Fasten your seatbelts for takeoff. We're about to go very, very fast. I have known my guest, Dr. Joe Burkes, tonight on my show for many, many years. We first met many moons ago at the UFO Congress when it was still hosted by Bob Brown on the banks of the Colorado River in Laughlin, Nevada. I was there last year in the Palm Springs where we were at. The hotel has now closed, but Joe and I are still good friends. We have, over the years, we've had many discussions about the importance of consciousness. I think Joe is into it as much as I am. We've also had many conversations about the messages that might be coming from the phenomena and how that might help the world. Dr. Burkes was a board certified, I believe he's retired, was a board certified internist living in Southern California. He received his doctor degree from Tufts University in medicine in Boston, Massachusetts. He was born in New York in 1949. And he was early on in the early 1990s, he was part of the Stephen Greer's group. He ran the Los Angeles Working Group as the coordinator for the CE-5 initiative. We have lots of things to talk about. We've talked about a lot about CE-5s, about Mission Rama. But my first question tonight, I sort of gave Joe a heads up about this. During the 1980s, according to Joe's biography, as the nuclear arms race intensified, he and thousands of other medical doctors joined the Physicians for Social Responsibility, an organization established to educate the public and government leaders about the medical consequences of nuclear war. As I've pointed out in the past, 35 years after my first sighting in Carmen, Manitoba, I suddenly realized there may have been a nuclear connection to this, that at the same time that the sightings occurred on the north side of the border in Canada where I lived, the Americans had put in the only operational anti-ballistic missile unit ever to go operational in the United States. And so I became very interested in this nuclear weapon connection. And everybody knows that in 1967, UFO shut down 10 nuclear missiles at Malmstrom Air Force Base. And a lot of people have sort of spun this as a threat. They're playing with our nuclear weapons. Even the most recent Nimitz thing involved in a nuclear aircraft carrier. And so there's this nuclear connection that seems to pop up all the time. So there's some documents that have just been released, and I wanted just Joe to give a comment on this, and then we'll get to the more important stuff. there's some documents that have been released by the National Archives Records Administration, and I guess they may have been FOIA'd by the National Security Archives, which is at the at the Washington University in Washington, D.C. And I've been there. I was looking for some UFO files there many years ago. They actually have a file from a reporter who claimed to be in contact with a Secret Service agent who had been in Jimmy Carter's UFO briefing. So I've been there. It's a fascinating place, all these national security documents, the FOI, and they've just recently come up with some documents that deal with what's called a single integrated operational plan drawn up in 1964 by the U.S. military. And we always look at why did Maelstrom happen? And because of my own experience in 1975, knowing that maybe it's something you really don't see that's going on in the background, like this anti-ballistic missile unit that was put in North Dakota that may have caused the sightings here. The Maelstrom thing may have been caused by a bunch of stuff in the background that you didn't see. And these documents point out this 1964 plan to basically decapitate the Soviet Union and the China with a strike, a nuclear strike. And it's I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it's pretty sad reading. Basically, it was to take out 71% of Russia's urban population and 53% of the city dwellers in China, according to an earlier estimate. And basically, the scariest part of the whole thing was that the plan involved dropping the nuclear weapons on civilians rather than industrial targets. It was to leave the industrial targets. And the idea came from a 1940 document that said this is done, must be to reduce the morale of the enemy civilization population through fear. So the idea was you drop the bombs on the civilians and they sort of fight back and they get the higher authorities to change the policy. So in light of this, I know that the UFOs have a tremendous interest in nuclear weapons. And I just want to get a comment from Joe. I think you've read some of these documents. And based upon your work on nuclear weapons, do you see a nuclear connection to the UFO phenomena? And if so, what is it?
Well, thank you for inviting me to your show. But that's one of the hardest questions I've ever gotten because we've just covered discussing the PSYOP from 1964, the Integrated Operational Plan. And to really address the question, one would have to go back even further. And that was 1945 when nuclear weapons were used for the first time. And to just briefly review the history of that terrible conflict, 1945, Japan was devastated. Their economy was smashed. Fire bombings, there were not nuclear attacks, but fire bombings of Tokyo and other cities resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands of people in firestorms. And so at the end of the war, the Americans were faced with terrible decisions. Okinawa was invaded with tremendous losses on both sides, and an invasion. Okinawa was an island off the main island in Japan. And the Americans were faced with the loss of perhaps tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of troops in an invasion. And so the decision was made to drop the bomb. But the bomb did not really have military value. Just as that 1964 document that you referred to as basically describing terrorism to wipe out civilian population to the tune of tens or hundreds of millions as an act of terror, that was also the strategy behind the attack in 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These cities had not been bombed, and they were attacked primarily because nuclear war fighters, people who made the decision to drop the bomb, wanted to see what the damage would be. Some people have even called the attack a nuclear test. And it was designed to kill as many people as possible and act as an act of terror. So that handles the aspect of the question about what was the significance historically of the 1964 document that you described. But I think long view of the Cold War brings into light the perspective that the United States has used nuclear weapons even after Hiroshima, not necessarily as an act of violence, but as a threat. And during the Korean War, another terrible conflict that tens of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands or even millions of Koreans and Chinese died. During the Korean War, there was open discussion of using nuclear weapons in 1950 when the Chinese entered the war and drove America back all across Korea. And there was a question of whether nuclear weapons would be used. Fortunately, they were not. It came up again in the 1960s during the Vietnam War, during the Battle of Khe Sanh, who many of you are too young to remember. It was a situation where Americans were outnumbered 5-1 at this base. There were 5,000 Marines facing 20,000 North Vietnamese regulars who were just devastating the base with continuous artillery fire. And a decision was made to discuss whether nuclear weapons should be used under those conditions. Years later, we realized that these weapons were used again, not necessarily as an act of violence, but as a threat. And it was communicated to the North Vietnamese that if Khe Sanh was about to be overrun, nuclear weapons could be used. And that may have deterred the North Vietnamese. So we have similar situations in Korea, the threat of use, and now we have, in 25 years later, Vietnam. And now, believe it or not, people, maybe not the most responsible ones in the world, but people are talking about the use of nuclear weapons against not the Vietnamese, not the Koreans, not the Japanese, not Asian people, but extraterrestrial people. And so we have someone like Tom DeLonge, who is a very prominent player in the UFO scene and is head of the To the Stars Academy, has openly thought about the use of nuclear weapons against the presumed threat of extraterrestrials. And as a lifelong volunteer activist in peace and social justice causes, I think that we must do as Physicians for Social Responsibility, which was the organization I was in the 1980s, trying to stop the nuclear arms race. The slogan of our organization was, "We must prevent what we cannot cure," and there is no cure for nuclear war. So it's my hope that with the latest disclosures that are happening from To the Stars Academy, that Tom DeLonge and the people around him will not pursue such a bellicose and, I think, very dangerous line of discussion when it comes to nuking the ETs. Yeah. So in 6 minutes or less, that's my answer to one of the hardest questions I've ever had on radio.
Well, yeah, it's a tough issue, and that seems to be, like a lot of people believe, that's when the UFOs sort of appeared in force once we detonated the first atomic bomb. And I know I've read we're going to get to your piece that you wrote for this new book, Beyond UFOs. And you've asked some contactees about, and a lot of them do get that message from the beings about the concern about nuclear weapons, correct?
Absolutely. This is a concern expressed by the so-called ETs during these high strangeness encounters, not just covers nuclear weapons, but also unsafe nuclear technology, nuclear power, environmental destruction. People are often shown images of what they are led to believe are future events where nuclear war and environmental destruction are the themes of those what you can call psychic downloads or interactions that the extraterrestrials stage. So we have a situation where no one quite is certain what the intention of the extraterrestrials are. However, people who are like myself, and I'm a contact experiencer or contactee, although I prefer to refer to myself as a contact activist, and we can talk about the difference between a contactee and an activist. I believe that we should take the high ground and assume that the extraterrestrials are approachable. We can attempt to achieve more equality in our interactions by going out and engaging them. That's why I've been to this day, a very big supporter of what is called the CE-5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, or I prefer the term that I coined, HICE, Human-Initiated Close Encounters or Human-Initiated Contact Experiences. So I think that we have a responsibility as world citizens to attempt to stop a violent engagement with extraterrestrials if that can be achieved.
Yeah. The one thing I sort of thought about is, they use this idea that it was a threat because they shut down the nuclear missiles. I sort of figured this is like the one time when it proved you could actually shut this thing down. The Canadians actually, as you may know, the guy who ran the Canadian government UFO program or the Flying Saucer program in the early 1950s was an experiencer, and he stated that the being that he was in contact with had said they would never really intervene in the world unless there was a nuclear exchange. And at that point, they would step in and they could shut the whole thing down. And to prove they could take the entire moon in front of the entire world, split it in half, and put it back together to prove that they could do it. So I always laugh when people say, that this is a threat when they're shutting down the nuclear missiles. I say rather than a threat, they should just cancel the Nobel Peace Prize for 20 years and give it to the aliens every single year. Because, if you could shut this down, all these nuclear missiles, that would take off such a strain on our ability to sort of wipe ourselves out, almost like the famous physicist Dr. David Bohm said, we are as if it was a swarm of locusts had descended upon the earth, where we sort of are our own worst enemies. Now, you mentioned the CE-5 thing, and you got involved. Maybe talk a little about the CE-5 and then talk about how you got involved with the Free Foundation. And for the people who don't understand what the CE-5 initiative was or the Free Foundation, sort of explain what these organizations were and the importance of these two aspects of your life.
Right, sure. Well, in 1991, I took a walk on the wild side. I had an unsuccessful home renovation project in West Los Angeles and an overpriced piece of real estate, and that my wife and I had purchased, and we were remodeling to give her a studio. Well, all the bad things happened, as you might expect with remodeling. Contractor kept repeatedly saying there's a problem, and then after that he said it's going to cost more. And so I was working lots of extra duty at the hospital. I was working in the emergency room as an internist, but an admitting officer as well. And so I went to the local public library and says, I'm under a lot of stress. We have no roof. It's raining. It's December. This is 1991. I got to have a hobby. I got to distract myself. What do you got on? And I don't know where the thought came from. I said, what do you got on UFOs? So she pulled out a book. It was the Gulf Breeze sightings, about a wave of sightings that occurred down in South Florida. And I started reading on the subject. And then about a year later, I had enough courage to go to my first UFO meeting. And there was a tall, bearded doctor, an emergency room physician. That was my vocation at the time. And he said his name was Stephen Greer, and that he had developed a program to interact with what he called extraterrestrial intelligence by having skilled researchers go out into the field and use protocols that were basically consciousness-based, thought projection, mental telepathy, that sort of thing, and that UFOs could be attracted to secure locations for limited interactions. Well, I had been an activist, and you mentioned the Physicians for Social Responsibility. Our organization was part of a world movement called International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. We engaged in citizen diplomacy. And our organization won the Nobel Prize in 1985 for our efforts to bring Soviet and American doctors together. And so when Dr. Greer said he had a citizens diplomatic initiative to reach out to the extraterrestrials, and I had been reading about this subject for a year and was pretty interested in it, I signed up. And, after that, the rest is history. I started having sightings when I formed my team. We had amazing encounters with Golden Globes. When I traveled to Mexico with Dr. in 1993, a large triangular-shaped craft came out between the volcanoes, the volcanic zone, 100 miles to the east of Mexico City, where there was a wave going on, and this enormous UFO blocked out the stars. We signaled at it. It signaled back. At that point, I was pretty convinced that we were not alone in the universe, and was part of an effort to try to, perhaps for once in our history, to take the high ground, to try to engage the extraterrestrials on peaceful terms rather than assuming that they're the enemy and shoot first and ask questions later. So that was my CE-5 CSETI experience. I worked with Dr. Greer for 5 years. We had some political and personal differences, and I left the organization in 1998, but had, I still support very much the efforts of the worldwide community. That is not just a CSETI or the CE-5 initiative, but also involves many, many groups, including Rama, which is a Peruvian contactee-based contact network. And I've done field work with them and experienced a Xendra in 2009 and other type of experiences like that. So these are the things that maintain my interest. And then when I heard about the FREE study, which is the Foundation for Research into Extraordinary and Extraterrestrial Encounters, and Edgar Mitchell was one of the founders of that organization. And I had met him in 1997 as part of what was called behind closed door briefings when the Disclosure Project headed by Dr. Greer was meeting with members of Congress and their staff. So when I heard that Edgar Mitchell was part of this group and they were studying the consciousness aspects of the contact experience, with all my years of contact work, I wanted to be part of it. And they initiated an amazing survey with hundreds of questions that involved over 4,000 self-avowed contact experiencers. And the results were pretty amazing in that the overwhelming majority of contact experiencers in this study described very positive encounters, which was my encounters as well with UFO intelligence that were very positive. So rather than the stereotype of all contacts with aliens are result in abductions. In fact, the nurses used to kid me when I worked in the emergency room, and they knew that on weekends I would leave my team out into the field. And we had three doctors in our medical group who were also part of the CE-5 initiative, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative. The nurses used to kid me, say, Dr. Burkes, are you going out to chase UFOs? And I would kid them back. I would say, in my best New York accent, which is my original speech pattern, I'd say, "You think that I'm chasing UFOs? Well, let me tell you something. They're chasing me." and sure enough, when we'd go out into the field, and Joshua Tree was our field laboratory for 4 or 5 years, we would. Even before we got to our jumping off point to hike into the backcountry, Golden Globes on several occasions appeared as if they knew in anticipation we were coming to try to engage them. So these are the kinds of experiences that made me want to support the FREE organization, consciousness study, not just of UFOs, but what they call the contact modalities, which include shamanistic experiences, remote viewing, all the other high strangeness contact with non-human intelligence mediated by consciousness. So they wanted to investigate whether there were people who were having medical healings, and over half of the people who answered the question, so over 1,000, said indeed that they did have medical healings. We got hundreds and hundreds of reports, and we went through them and selected the best cases for in-detailed analysis, which meant spending many hours on the phone, or in my case, I also met these people in person by traveling to Miami, where I met with 4 of the contact experiencers that I describe in the book. And we came up with some pretty amazing cases which indicate medical healings by non-human intelligences presumed to be extraterrestrials is very real. And we can talk about some of those cases in our time, because I know we're going straight through and not going to be taking a break. Yeah.
I want you to give me a couple examples. But first, you mentioned something new I'd never heard before. You were involved in a Xendra case. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I think I should mention the experience of my coworker and close friend Joe Vallejo. Captain Vallejo was a 747 pilot who was on my contact team. He was United Airlines based in Los Angeles. And he and I got involved with Rama around the same time in 1993. And because he was a pilot, he could easily fly up to Northern California. And it's not at Mount Shasta, but it's referred to by the contact activists in Rama as Shasta, in a secure location. In 1994, when he was very active in my contact team, he traveled up to the Shasta area in Northern California, and using a special chant, they opened a dimensional portal, which was described as a Xendra, spelled with an X. And the method they used were chanting Om, and they had many of the people were very advanced psychically, and was a large group of some 40 or 50 people. And in groups of 7, these Hispanic contact workers went into this dimensional portal, which formed when a purple light appeared about 50 yards away from the group. The purple light then spread and formed a kind of doorway in the middle of the field. And the contact activists in Rama, in groups of 7, went into this dimensional portal, which my friend Captain Joe Vallejo described as being a very tight space like an elevator, where the 7 of them were very cramped, the walls were indistinct, and within that Xendra, the quality of their voices had changed as if they were underwater, and their movements were distorted. So there was some time-space distortion apparently going on in this space. Now, the funny part of the story that Joe told me was that he was one of the last groups that went into the Xendra, and in order to maintain this dimensional portal, the contactees had been told they need to continue chanting. But after 7 groups of 7 had gone to Xendra, the group outside were getting really tired, and the chanting was very much diminished, and the Xendra started to collapse with my friend Joe Vallejo and 6 other contact activists inside it. And they did not want to be in that Xendra, because they didn't know where they were going to find themselves if the thing collapsed. So the group of the 7 of them started chanting Om with tremendous vigor. They watched as the Xendra reconstituted themselves, and they were able to safely get out of that thing. And the Xendra is a teleportation device that allegedly was used by Sixto Paz and his co-workers back in 1974 in Lima, Peru, were supposedly, at least as they reported it, they were transported to what they were led to believe was an ET base on the moon of Jupiter that we call Ganymede, and Sixto Paz was called Moreland. So when I heard this story from Joe, and of course everybody in the contact network on the West Coast had heard about this, we were very excited. I wanted to have that experience too, and so in 2004 and 2006 and then 2009, I went to Northern California to work with the Rama people. And I mentioned it was 2009, but actually my Xendra experience was 2006, which was 12 years after 1994, when my coworker Joe Vallejo, Captain Vallejo, had his Xendra experience. And the people who were leading the group, and this is Dr. Fernando Lamaco, who's a Peruvian contactee and retired oral surgeon, he told us that we should not have any expectations about what was going to occur. Of course, I had it all wrong. I kept waiting for the purple light to appear. I wanted to see the Xendra, and I wanted to walk in and see the time days. That's not what happened. There was distortion of time and space, but it was not in the way that I had anticipated. As we were there chanting and we were standing, and if you ever join a fieldwork activity of Mission Rama, you are asked to stand for hours at a time chanting Om, which in itself will probably induce an altered state through exhaustion. In any case, as I was there chanting, the sound of the stream that was running by our fieldwork site suddenly became very, very, very loud. It was as if the conductivity of sound had altered. Also, suddenly I felt a force pulling me forward towards the Xendra, and I almost stumbled as I tried to regain my equilibrium. But there was some kind of force. I was not falling from fatigue. Other people have had similar type of experiences. So that was my limited Xendra experience. But other people have described what Captain Joe Vallejo has described to me and also to you as well. You interviewed him.
Yeah, thanks to you. I mean, and I can remember talking to him about the Xendra experience, and all I kept thinking while he was talking is like, this guy's a United 747 airline pilot. This is not just some guy off the street. And then he also described, like in the interview with me, and you're the one that put me on, is that he actually flew the craft using consciousness. He was actually flying the flying saucer. And this is a commercial airline pilot who's telling the story. So I appreciate that. One other little thing, and then we'll quickly get to these examples of healing. A little bit on your friend, the Russian guy. You always, when you tell the story, I'm always very interested in. We talked about people being sort of like antennas, or people. There's one person in the group who seems to be able to bring the experience on, and you mentioned this Russian guy that was in your group.
Right. Well, as a background, I should mention that as part of my peace activist activities, and also I was involved in not just the anti-nuclear movement, but also the student movement that attempted to end the war in Vietnam, that we routinely had to experience surveillance and infiltration by police, either the local Red Squad from Los Angeles or the FBI. And so I, as an activist within the peace and social justice movements, I was very aware of certain kind of intelligence activities that were directed against our social movements. And so when I started work in the Contact network, I immediately noticed that there was clear evidence of surveillance when we would go out into doing field work. There would be in December of 1992, we'd show up in the middle of the desert, in the middle of winter, and at the jumping off point, which in Joshua Tree National Monument is called backboards, where you park your vehicle and then you can hike into the backcountry. There would be muscular young men who just happened to show up. One looked like a Navy SEAL and could probably press his own weight. And there was nobody out there. I mean, it was just the middle of winter. And he made some comment about, isn't it strange that other people besides himself wanted to take a walk, at night, desert at night. This guy was built like a fire plug, He was wearing shorts and it was December. At 4,000 foot elevation. So we experienced surveillance. And when I met Misha, who that's not his real name, he's a young Russian lad, 21 years my junior. He shows up in the emergency room as a new hire at Kaiser Panorama City, and he's an EKG tech. And he mentioned, because my mother's family are from Russia, and because I studied Russian, which I used when I was an international peace activist and had been to Moscow and working with the Soviet physicians to try to mount this anti-nuclear campaign that eventually won the Nobel Prize. So we have a similar background of Russian and Jewish. So, I spent time chatting with this young Russian EKG tech. He worked there for a year. And I remember one time he asked me, after he started working as an EKG tech, what do you think of life in outer space? And I didn't know who he was, and I initially wasn't very open about my contact work and going out in the desert. So I told him, well, it's a big universe. If there wasn't life out there, it would be an incredible waste of space. It was, I guess, a line out of Contact movie. Jodie Foster's boyfriend used that. So a year into his employment, he shows up and he says, I really want to join the team. And he starts telling about all his contact experiences in Russia, that he had been trained as a lad without any parental supervision, but based on his contacts with what he called ETs, to do very deep meditation. He called it yoga. And while in these altered states, he could communicate with the intelligences. And he even described having what he thought was an onboard experience where he had tremendous right lower quadrant pain when he was 14 years old. He and his friends were directed to go down to the local river in this small town it was a small city in Belarus where he lived. And he had memories of an onboard experience and an appendectomy, but no scar. Wow. So he's a raging contactee. He wants to help me. And I said to him, Misha, you've been working here a year. Why didn't you sign up and tell me about your adventures. And the answer he gave was chilling. Said to me, because you weren't ready yet. I was not ready to handle him. And the clear suggestion was then, and I subsequently had experiences which confirmed that initial impression, that he had direct telepathic communication with UFO intelligences. And these encounters that we were having were not accidental. They were staged. And that's what the Rama people they call them programmed encounters. Yeah. So, and of course, Dr. Greer was another example of someone during the early years when he was very close to UFO intelligence. And I have no doubt he had direct telepathic communication with them. Wherever Dr. Greer went, we'd have multiple sightings with multiple witnesses. Things changed in subsequent years, but that's another very long discussion. Yeah. And so I developed this theory of prime contactee, and I met a whole number of people in the process of my travels. Prime contactees are people who have a lifelong contact with UFO intelligence from early age. They're trained with apparently no parental supervision to take yoga, or in Dr. Greer's case, it was TM, Transcendental Meditation, and that they function, as you say, like an antenna. They can tell you when the encounters are going to occur and where they're going to occur. And so that was, Misha was a tremendous aid we worked together for 4 years in the contact network. And it's like in Hollywood, it's not what you know that gets you the high paying job, it's who you know. If you want to have contact experiences, hang with the high level contactees, and you'll never be lonely again.
It's interesting you mentioned the meditation, because that's what struck me when I met a lot of the Mission Rama people, although Ricardo Gonzalez and Villanueva, these guys don't really consider themselves directly Rama people anymore. But we hear them tell their story. I mean, they're 14, 15 years old, and usually if you're a 14, 15-year-old boy, you're playing sports or you're chasing girls. And these guys were talking about they were meditating every day. And it's like, 14 and 15, you're meditating? It's like, it's just bizarre, almost like it was intended right from the word go. Do you still do the contact stuff? Are you still leading groups and stuff like that?
Oh, no, I'm pushing this. I'm in my 7th decade of life. And I can tell you that working with Rama, try to meditate standing up, chanting for several hours. The hips, the knees, the back, everything is hurting. Contact work, and it is work. And that's the reason I don't particularly like the word contactee, because in English, the E ending, payee, contactee, abductee, this is a passive kind of mode. Or flunky, ending with an E, ER, which is an active designation. A worker, a baker, a singer, a dancer. This is an active. So I call myself a retired contact worker, but I still consider myself a contact activist. I've not had a sighting for a couple of years, but I encourage the next generation of contact workers to go out there and have their encounters while I write up my memoirs and publish my stories on the internet and get to talk to people out in the KGRA audience. And thank you for listening.
Yeah, you do a lot of writing. Maybe before we get to the end here, spell out your website, because you do a lot of very intense and well thought out writing.
I don't have a website anymore. I just have Facebook.
You just have Facebook?
Yeah, I just have Facebook. I plan to publish a book, and then I probably will need a website at that point for commercial reasons. Yeah. My interest lies in promoting several key concepts. Okay. One of which I mentioned, the prime contactees. These are the people I met. And if we had more time, I could tell you about some of the other prime contactees, including one prime that was a woman, which was unusual. She used to set up her video cameras at Lake Ontario, for you Canadians who are listening in. Oh. And she lived in Toronto. In broad daylight, she would go to sleep at this campsite, and the UFOs would parade over Lake Ontario in front of her camera, one of which was a 200-foot golden disc. So I had lots of experiences with the prime contactees, or people who you'd call antennas, and what I found is that these people are not so rare, and UFO intelligence actually guided me. So they met a whole bunch of them, And my guess is that 1% of the population are experiencers on this planet. 10% of the people on this planet have had a sighting. 1% are contact experiencers, and a small percentage of them are prime contactees. We're looking at, if 1% of the world's population has had our contacts, we're talking about something like 70 million people.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Interesting. And so now you've gone to this very important aspect that I think, and that's the key, is I've always realized, is that if you want to learn about the intelligence, you got to go to the people who are interacting with the intelligence, which is what you've done with the prime contactees. But you've taken up this medical thing, which I found very interesting. I remember when the book came out by Preston Dennett many years ago, I read the book. I talked to him about it. I've known a couple of people who've been healed, so I was familiar with this. And you've gone into that. So maybe give us a couple of examples. And maybe if you do, I don't know if you've got any explanation of why are these people being healed, and give us a couple of examples of very dramatic things that you saw as a physician that would indicate this is something that people should pay attention to.
Yeah, I think Preston is just an amazing resource. His books and he was on my contact team originally in 1992. So we go back 20. I was a much younger Dr. Burkes, and he was even younger than me. He was in his 20s when he started contact work.
Wow.
And Preston did publish that book in 96, UFO Healings. I'm not sure if it's still in print. But when I found out that he was going to be working with me on the chapter on UFO healings in the book, which I hope everyone runs out and gets, or at least orders it, since it's not going to be in bookstores too soon, but can be gotten from Amazon. And that's Beyond UFOs, where the findings of this enormous free study has been described. So we picked out some of the better cases out of the hundreds and hundreds of people who claimed they had been healed. One of the cases was someone who you may have met in your encounters. I know he's been on KGRA radio, and that's a Reverend
Carter?
Michael Carter.
Yeah.
Yes. And he was a contact experiencer who had his first encounter in late 1980s when a white being appeared suddenly in his bedroom. The temperature dropped and scared the hell out of him. He then went on to have frequent dreams and repeated encounters with other types of beings that would manifest in where he was staying in Manhattan and New York City. And at one point, he was going through a really very hard time, I think his father had just passed away, and he was going through a difficult divorce, and he developed a thrombophlebitis, which is blood clots in his leg that had extended all the way up from his calf to his groin. Blood clots, thrombophlebitis, is when you have inflammation as well. And so he had pain and massive swelling of his lower extremity. The typical treatment for this is to get an MRI, which he had, and it showed the clot had extended, from the tip of his, from his lower extremity all the way up into his groin. And he was treated initially with a blood thinner, injectable, escitalopram, and then he was going to be switched over to Coumadin, which is an oral anticoagulant. Now, these anticoagulants don't cure the thrombophlebitis. What they do is they prevent the clot that was in his leg to extend into his abdomen, because if a large clot breaks off, it can go to the heart, and the right heart pumps it into the lung. You can have a pulmonary embolus. If the clot is large enough, it can damage tissue, which is a pulmonary infarct, and it's one of the leading causes of sudden death in our society, is pulmonary emboli. So he potentially had a life-threatening condition, but he was getting treatment. But only after a few days on the medication, he had a visitation. He described it as a typical Nordic type of being, very powerful, over 6 foot, blonde, wearing kind of hoodie, who extended his right hand, out of which a beam of green light traveled from the hand and struck Reverend Carter in the abdomen, which I think is of significance. And he passed out, but the next day his leg, which had been as swollen. He said, my leg was so swollen, it looked like there's a famous basketball player named DeBron, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he said his leg looked like that, and all of a sudden the swelling went down. He went to the doctor, and the doctor, I believe, was appropriately in shock, because swelling of that nature takes weeks and weeks, not just 5 or 6 or 7 days, to come down. And so he had been cured by non-human intelligence for a potentially life-threatening condition. Another case was by an emergency room physician who was a young doctor. He did not want any identifying information other than his age, which is now 35, and he works in an ER. And several years ago, when he was just a medical student, he required an extraction, a wisdom tooth to be removed. He went to his oral surgeon, who removed it, but there was a complication. They had cut the inferior alveolar artery in his mandible, and he was bleeding quite profusely at the end of the procedure. They told him, just put some local pressure on it and it should stop. But it did not. He went home, and the hemorrhaging continued. It was pulsatile, which means from the medicalese that it was arterial bleeding. Each beat of his heart filled his mouth with a squirt of blood coming from this wisdom tooth extraction site. And so pretty soon the apartment was looking awful, because he had used gauze to try to stop it. There was blood everywhere. And unfortunately, doctors don't always make the best patients. And the only emergency room that was capable in the town where he was living at the time to deal with him was the very emergency room where he was being trained as a young doctor. He did not want to be a patient in that hospital. He delayed. Finally, he realized he was in big trouble. He started getting diaphoretic, which means he was sweating. He looked in the mirror. He was white as a ghost. He felt lightheaded. His heart was racing. He knew he had to get help right away, but he passed out. The next thing he remembers, he was covered with white light. He was floating. And when he regained consciousness, he was floating in a circular-shaped room. The walls were made of metal, and there were all kinds of wires. He looked down on the floor of this room where he was floating, and he could see the floor was an image of the planet Earth from space. And he could see the stars and the Earth, and he realized he wasn't in Kansas anymore. And so an ET being was there. He didn't remember any direct treatment or any transfusions being done, but the next thing he knew, he woke up at home. Place was covered in blood, but he felt perfectly fine. He was not short of breath. He was not dizzy. He wasn't sweaty. His color was good. He would have required at least 1 or 2 units of blood if he had been treated in the emergency room where he should have gone. Instead, he was healed, presumably by the extraterrestrials who had taken him to that, shall we say, a higher treatment facility, higher level of care. So that was another one of these amazing cases. Now, most of the people who are healed, when they ask, why did you heal me? The responses are usually the same. We heal our own, was one contact experiencer's recorded answer when she asked, I should say, why are you helping me? Over a long term, people develop relationships with the extraterrestrials in which there's a strong identification, not only from the humans who start feeling like ETs are family, but presumably the ETs are attached as well. And so long-term experiencers are getting these healings, usually when they've been of a service to the extraterrestrials. So several of the people in our story, our chapter, had long-term relationships that involved harvesting sexual semen from men or other biological procedures for women having to do with ovum. And so it seems likely that's one of the reasons why ETs will produce a healing. I think you have to have a long-term relationship with them, and that's part of the answer to the question.
Okay. Now, Jacobs and Hopkins, the two big researchers that worked with people who've had these type of experiences claimed that it was very rare, but you found out in the survey, it's what, 50% have a member of the family or themselves have been healed. And is it 40% of people claim they can actually heal themselves, that they can heal other people?
Well, one of the cases that we described was an individual who had encounters with mantoid beings, and he described having years of spiritual and psychic training across a wide spectrum of esoteric subjects that the extraterrestrials tutored him on, and he actually was able to, at least according to the narrative, heal himself. He thought he healed himself from appendicitis, as well as being able to recover from brain surgery operation that he was told there was almost no chance for survival, but in an act of desperation, they operated on him to remove a brain tumor below his pituitary gland. So some people receive extensive psycho-spiritual training that enables them not only to heal others, but also to heal themselves, as was documented in at least one of the cases that we investigated.
Okay, so now you're a old school doctor, using chemical pills and operations.
Yeah.
Have you any idea of how this is working, and is there any chance that we can learn anything from it, or is it so far beyond our medicine that it's going to take years to catch up to what they're actually doing here?
Things are changing rapidly. The new openness that we're seeing from people within the military-industrial complex to the STARS Academy and the coverage from the New York Times indicates to me that we may be moving rapidly to a point where large numbers of people are going to know that we're not alone. Under conditions of increased awareness about this phenomena, it's likely that in my judgment, the extraterrestrials will respond with higher levels of contact with us. Right now, there are many people who are engaging the extraterrestrials. Some are actually reporting onboard experiences in full psychomotor control of their bodies. A lot of these people have been instructed not to be part of any contact network because of security issues in terms of surveillance and even infiltration into contact teams. And we could talk about that in a later show, focusing with surveillance. So a year ago, if you had said to me, to ask that question about whether we can introduce those healing modes into our terrestrial medical technological armamentarium, I would say no. But now things are moving in a direction. And I think free is playing a very important role in terms of giving people like myself and Preston opportunities to listen to the experiencers who have had healings. And in our chapter, we answer your question in great detail. And I suspect that under conditions of cooperation with extraterrestrial intelligence over decades, perhaps generations, we will be able to integrate some of their healing modalities into the medical practice. After all, they are teaching people to heal themselves and others. Some of these cases are quite remarkable. And if meditation and prayer can actually promote healing with the assistance of extraterrestrials, as a physician, I'm not going to refuse to recommend that treatment if it works.
Are there other doctors besides you working with free and trying to look at this? Because when you see the numbers, it's a fair amount of research that's got to be done. A lot of people are reporting this. So how many cases do you look at, and is there other doctors helping you do this kind of stuff?
There are no other physicians in free. That's unfortunate. But with the publication of the book, and hopefully physicians will read our chapter, and also not just doctors, but nurses and other health professionals, so that the opportunities for recruiting additional assistance and doing the necessary studies are there. I suspect a lot of the people believe they had healings, but if you examine them closely, it was more a reflection of their positive experience towards the extraterrestrials. Because they're having ongoing contacts, they develop a medical condition, they ask for healing, which was the case of one of the people we interviewed. She actually requested a contactee who was channeling ET, she requested that they send an ET to her to heal her, and she had suffered for 25 years of chronic fatigue syndrome. She was healed overnight from a condition that had disabled her for 25 years, and she had an onboard experience. So I think that with more openness and this issue becoming more less fringe and more mainstream, there'll be many opportunities to engage the extraterrestrials and promote the healing techniques that apparently are being disseminated on contact experiences.
Wow. Well, I thank you, Joe, for doing this. The book that you're referring to is called Beyond UFOs, The Science of Consciousness and Contact with Non-Human Intelligence, Volume 1. I say it is the most important UFO book ever written because it gets past the sightings and all that kind of stuff and gets to the consciousness aspect, which you and I have worked on. And so anybody that wants to give you an experience, I don't know if Preston is doing another book. I talked to him, he said he might. But if anybody wants to contact you, it's on Facebook, Dr. Joe Burkes. And let's do another show. And because you've got so much material, we can get into the consciousness aspect and some of the other stuff you did. We've had a lot of discussions, and I really appreciate your dealing with this very important issue of this, something that might be very helpful to mankind, this idea that there you can be healed, that there is this medicine beyond what we presently know.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Race.
You've been listening to the Cameron Files with Grant Cameron. Any rebroadcast or duplication of this program or program content without express written permission from the KGRA-DB is strictly prohibited. The Cameron Files, in direct cooperation with the internet website presidentialufo.com.